On a humid morning in July 1925, in the small village of Analuar in the Kasai province of Belgian Congo, a child was born who would shake the foundations of colonial Africa. His name was Patrice Lumumba. His parents were simple people from the Bashateller tribe, farmers who worked land that belonged to them for generations but was now claimed by distant Belgian masters. Young Patrice was different from other children. While they played in the red dust of the village parks, he sat listening to the elders, absorbing every story, every grievance, every whispered dream of freedom. When he was old enough, the missionaries came for him. They saw something in his bright eyes and took him to their Catholic school. There, in a small room with wooden benches and a single crucifix on the wall, Patrice learned French. He learned it quickly, hungrily, understanding that language was power in this divided world. He read everything he could find: the Bible, French literature, newspapers that arrived weeks late from Europe. At night, by candlelight, he copied passages into notebooks, practicing his handwriting, refining his thoughts. His teachers were impressed but also worried. There was something rebellious in how he questioned everything, how he refused to accept that the white man's way was the only way. The colonial system had created a hierarchy where Africans were subjects, not citizens, where their labor enriched Belgium while they remained poor. In 1944, at 19, Lumumba left his village for Stanleyville, the bustling city on the Congo River. He carried everything he owned in a small cloth bag: 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers, and his precious notebooks. The city overwhelmed him at first. The colonial buildings stood tall and white, the European quarter separated from the African neighborhoods by invisible but impenetrable walls. He found work as a postal clerk, a position that gave him a window into the lives of thousands. Every day, he handled letters, telegrams, packages. He read the addresses, noticed patterns, understood the networks that connected people across this vast territory. In the evenings, he wrote letters for illiterate workers who wanted to communicate with families in distant villages. They paid him in coins and trust, and he gained something more valuable: an understanding of the hopes and struggles of ordinary Congolese people. Lumumba began to write. First, small articles for local newsletters about improving African communities. Then, more political pieces about dignity and rights. He joined associations, attended meetings, debated late into the night with other young intellectuals in cramped apartments filled with cigarette smoke and revolutionary ideas. They spoke of Gandhi in India, of the end of colonialism, of a new Africa rising. But speaking and acting were different things. In 1955, he was arrested and charged with embezzling money from the post office. The trial was quick. He was sentenced to a year in prison. Some said it was a setup to silence a troublemaker. Others said he had indeed taken money but used it to help struggling families. In prison, Lumumba had time to think. He read voraciously everything the prison library had. He emerged in 1956 not broken but hardened, more determined than ever. He moved to Leopoldville, the capital, and took a job with a brewery. He was good at it, rising quickly to become a sales director. But business was never his passion. Politics consumed him. In 1958, he founded the Movement National Congolais, the MNC. What made his party different was its vision. While other political movements organized along tribal lines, Lumumba preached unity. He traveled across the country, from the forests of the north to the mining towns of Katanga, always with the same message: we are all Congolese first, tribe second. His speeches were electric. He had a thin frame and wore thick glasses, but when he spoke, something transformed. His voice rose and fell like music, his hands painted pictures in the air, his eyes blazed with conviction. Crowds grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands. In December 1958, everything changed. Lumumba was invited to the All-African People's Conference in Accra, Ghana. It was his first time leaving the Congo, his first time seeing an independent African nation. Ghana's president, Kwame Nkrumah, had led his country to freedom just a year earlier. The two men met in a government building overlooking the Atlantic. Nkrumah, tall and confident in his traditional Kent cloth, gripped Lumumba's hand firmly. They talked for hours about Pan-Africanism, about unity, about the coming revolution. When Lumumba returned to Congo, he was a man possessed. The dream was no longer abstract. He had seen it, touched it, lived it for those few days in Accra. Then came January 1959. Riots erupted in Leopoldville after authorities banned a political meeting. The colonial police opened fire. Dozens died in the streets. The violence spread like wildfire across the country. The Belgians, who had ruled for 75 years with absolute confidence, suddenly panicked. They had always told themselves that the Congolese were not ready for independence, that it would take generations. Now they realized they had no choice. In January 1960, they announced elections would be held, and independence would come by June. 6 months. It was absurdly fast, recklessly unprepared, but the momentum was unstoppable. The election campaign was brutal. Lumumba crisscrossed the vast country, often traveling on foot or in aging vehicles that broke down on muddy roads. He slept little, ate less, and spoke constantly. His opponents called him a communist, a tribalist, a dangerous radical. But the people heard something else. They heard a man who believed in them, who painted a vision of a Congo that could stand proud among nations. When the votes were counted, the MNC had won a plurality. Lumumba would be the first Prime Minister of independent Congo. He was 34 years old. June 30th, 1960, was the hottest day of the year. The ceremony was held in the Palace of the Nation in Leopoldville. Dignitaries from around the world filled the hall, including King Baudouin of Belgium. The king gave a speech praising Belgian colonial rule, speaking of civilization brought to the Dark Continent, of the great work of Leopold II, ignoring the millions who had died under that brutal regime. The audience of Congolese leaders sat in stunned silence. This was supposed to be their day of freedom, and they were being lectured like children. Then Lumumba stood. He was not scheduled to speak. President Kasavubu shot him a warning glance, but Lumumba had already reached the podium. He adjusted his glasses, looked directly at the king, and began to speak. His words were fire. He spoke of the humiliation, the forced labor, the beatings, the land stolen, the resources plundered. He spoke of Congolese people worked to death building railroads, of children taken from families, of laws that made Africans third-class citizens in their own country. The hall erupted. Europeans sat frozen in shock. Congolese delegates leaped to their feet, applauding, shouting. King Baudouin's face turned red, then white. He left the ceremony early, insulted and furious. In Brussels, the speech was seen as an unforgivable outrage. But across Africa, young people gathered around radios, hearing Lumumba's words, and dared to hope. The independence lasted 1 week. On July 5th, soldiers in the Force Publique, the Congolese army still commanded by Belgian officers, mutinied. They were tired of taking orders from whites, tired of being paid less, tired of being treated like servants. The mutiny spread. Belgian civilians fled in panic. Reports, many exaggerated, spoke of violence against Europeans. Belgium, without consulting the new Congolese government, sent paratroopers. They landed in Leopoldville and other cities, claiming to protect their citizens. To Lumumba, this was a blatant violation of Congolese sovereignty. Independence had been a lie. Then came the worst blow. Moise Tcham, the leader of Katanga province, declared independence. Katanga held most of Congo's mineral wealth: copper, diamonds, uranium. Belgian mining companies, who had been exploiting these resources for decades, supported Tcham. They provided money, mercenaries, weapons. They wanted a puppet state they could control, not a unified Congo with a leader like Lumumba who talked about nationalizing resources. Lumumba appealed to the United Nations for help. UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld sent peacekeeping troops, but they had orders not to interfere in internal affairs. They stood by and watched as Katanga remained separate, as the country bled. Desperate and furious, Lumumba turned to the Soviet Union. This was 1960, the height of the Cold War. Anything that smelled of communism terrified the West. The Americans and Belgians, who had been wary of Lumumba from the start, now labeled him a dangerous radical, a potential communist dictator in the heart of Africa. In Washington, President Eisenhower and CIA Director Alan Dulles discussed the Lumumba problem in the Oval Office. They spoke in careful language, but the meaning was clear. Lumumba had to go. The CIA station chief in Leopoldville, Larry Devlin, received orders to find a way to remove him, by any means necessary. Poison was sent from Washington in a diplomatic pouch. Plans were drawn up. But events moved faster than assassination plots. On September 5, 1960, President Kasavubu, under pressure from Western powers and his own ambitions, announced on national radio that he was dismissing Lumumba as Prime Minister. Lumumba immediately went on radio to announce that he was dismissing Kasavubu as president. The country had two leaders, each claiming legitimacy. Parliament supported Lumumba, but Parliament no longer mattered. On September 14, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, the Army Chief of Staff who had been quietly supported and funded by the CIA, announced he was taking power. He was 29 years old, wearing sunglasses and a leopard skin hat. His soldiers surrounded Lumumba's residence. UN peacekeepers ringed the house, creating a barrier. For 10 weeks, Lumumba was trapped in his own home. He could see the soldiers outside, waiting. He wrote letters to his wife Pauline, to his children, to world leaders. He played with his young son in the garden, teaching him to read. He knew time was running out. On the night of November 27th, Lumumba made his decision. He would escape and travel to Stanleyville, where his supporters still held power. He could rally his base, build support, return triumphant. It was dangerous, but staying meant certain death or permanent imprisonment. A car was prepared. At 3 a.m, under a moonless sky, Lumumba, his wife, his infant son, and several aides slipped past the UN guards. They drove east, toward freedom. For 2 days, they traveled through back roads and forest paths. They stopped at villages where people recognized Lumumba and offered food, shelter, encouragement. But Mobutu's forces were hunting him. Roadblocks were set up. Radio messages crackled between military posts. On December 1st, at a river crossing, soldiers were waiting. Lumumba was pulled from the car. He was beaten immediately, his glasses smashed, his face blooded. His wife screamed. His son cried. The soldiers laughed. He was taken back to Leopoldville and imprisoned at military headquarters. They beat him daily, methodically. They wanted him broken, humiliated. Journalists were allowed to photograph him, bound and blooded in the back of a military truck, soldiers pulling his hair, his face a mask of pain and defiance. Those photographs went around the world. Protests erupted in Moscow, Cairo, Accra, and New York. The Soviets threatened to intervene. The United Nations debated. But words changed nothing. Lumumba sat in his cell, knowing what was coming. He wrote a final letter to his wife, words that would later become famous, speaking of history having its say, of freedom being worth any price, of his children growing up proud. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba and two of his ministers, Maurice Mpolo and Joseph Okito, were put on a plane. They were told they were being transferred to another prison. But the plane flew to Elizabethville, capital of Katanga, to Chom's territory, to his enemies. They knew. Lumumba knew. When they landed in the afternoon heat, a convoy of vehicles was waiting. They were driven to a house on the outskirts of the city. Belgian officers were there, men who had been advising Chom's forces. The details of what happened that night remain disputed, hidden in classified documents and protected by official secrecy. But this much is known. They were taken to an isolated spot in the bush. There were shots. 3 men fell. It was done. The bodies were initially buried, but there were fears they would become shrines, places of pilgrimage. So the decision was made to destroy them completely. A Belgian police officer named Gerard Soet later admitted that he and his brother dug up the corpses, cut them into pieces, and dissolved them in barrels of sulfuric acid. The bones that remained were ground up and scattered. Nothing was left. No grave, no memorial, no place for Lumumba's children to mourn their father. He was erased, made into a ghost. But ghosts have power. News of Lumumba's death sparked riots across Africa. The Soviet Union named a university after him. Streets and squares from Algeria to Tanzania bore his name. His face appeared on posters in student dorms and revolutionary hideouts. He became, in death, more powerful than he had ever been in life. A martyr, a symbol of African resistance against neo-colonialism and Western interference. Mobutu ruled Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for 32 years. He became one of Africa's most corrupt dictators, stealing billions while his people starved. The country Lumumba had dreamed of, united and prosperous, became a nightmare of poverty, war, and exploitation. The mining companies continued to extract wealth. Foreign powers continued to interfere. Nothing changed except the faces of those in power. Decades passed. In 2002, Belgium officially apologized for its role in Lumumba's assassination. Documents were declassified. The CIA admitted it had plotted to kill him, though they claimed others acted first. Gerard Soet, the Belgian officer who destroyed Lumumba's body, kept one thing, a tooth. He kept it in his home for years, a macabre trophy. After his death, his daughter gave it to Belgian authorities. In 2022, 61 years after Lumumba's murder, that single tooth was returned to Congo in a ceremony. His children, now elderly, received this tiny piece of their father. They buried it in a memorial in Kinshasa. At last, Lumumba had a grave. But his real legacy is not in that tomb. It lives in the continuing struggle for true African independence, in the resistance against exploitation, in the dream of a continent that controls its own destiny. Lumumba was Prime Minister for less than 7 months. He led a government that barely functioned. He made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, moved too fast in some ways and too slow in others. But he refused to bow. He refused to pretend that independence without sovereignty meant anything. He dared to tell the King of Belgium that colonial rule was not a gift but a crime. For that, they killed him. For that, he is remembered. In his last letter to his wife Pauline, written from prison as he awaited his fate, Lumumba wrote these words that echo across the decades: "A history will one day have its say. It will not be the history taught in Brussels, Paris, Washington, or the United Nations, but the history taught in countries freed from colonialism and its puppets. Africa will write its own history, and both north and south of the Sahara, it will be a history of glory and dignity. He never lived to see if his prophecy would come true. The Congo he left behind remained trapped in cycles of violence and poverty. But his words survived. His dream survived. And sometimes, in this imperfect world, that has to be enough.
The future of our continent lies in unity and resilience.